Hello, everybody, and welcome once more to another episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. Once more with your favorite host, the one and only Cave Cat. Episode 38 in the series, only 2 episodes away from reaching the magic number 40. But anyway, for today's episode, we're about to venture forth into the great outdoors, and I don't mean the 1987 film starring John Candy. Though speaking of John Candy, the cartoon that I'll be talking about actually stars John Candy in the main role, and it actually does deal with nature. That cartoon is none other than Camp Candy. Yeah, I briefly touched upon this cartoon in my Gravedale High review when I talked about how it was among several cartoons in the late 80s and early 90s to have a celebrity actor provide a voice, whether it's a character or a caricature of themselves. This show is no exception, because in this one, John Candy actually voices an animated version of himself in the main role. A lot of you might remember John Candy for starring in such films as Summer Rental, Volunteers, Armed and Dangerous, Spaceballs, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, The Great Outdoors, as I mentioned before, Uncle Buck, Who's Harry Crumb, Home Alone, and especially Disney's The Rescuers Down Under, among others. From what I heard, he was originally going to play Louis Tully in the original Ghostbusters film, but he got let go due to making too many demands about the role he was given that the filmmakers gave the role to Rick Moranis instead. Okay, now I'm just yammering, so it's time to just talk about the show itself. As you might have guessed by the title, Camp Candy is an animated Saturday morning series starring John Candy, who voices himself, the show having aired as a part of NBC's Saturday morning lineup in 1989. The show follows the exploits of an animated version of John Candy, who runs a summer camp as he tries his best to make sure that things are running smoothly at the camp, not just for the campers, but for the staff as well. But anyway, speaking of the characters, the 6 main campers that attend Camp Candy consist of 3 boys and 3 girls named Rick, Iggy, Binky, Alex, Robin, and Vanessa. As I mentioned before in a lot of my previous reviews, the characters each have their own personalities and quirks that really make them stand out. John himself is the friendly, intelligent, albeit rather bumbling camp counselor who strives to help and teach the campers about the basics of camping and nature, though he's often the butt of the joke regarding various mishaps that befall him during his lessons. For the other staff members of the camp, there's Nurse Molly, the camp nurse who has an unrequited crush on John, but still proves to be helpful and supportive to everyone at Camp Candy, and Botch, the camp chef who debuted in the 2nd season. And as for the campers, we have Alex, who's basically like the athlete of the group, being that she likes to partake in any kind of activity or sport at the camp. Robin is the token minority of the group, being African American, but with a huge soft spot for animals and doing her part to take care for them. Vanessa is the more spoiled and self-centered of the campers due to coming from a rich family and obsessed with fashion, but she's still supportive to the others even in spite of this. In a way, she almost reminds me of Veronica Lodge from the Archie comics, since both characters come from rich families. Now for the boys. Rick is the cool kid and resident prankster who likes to pull pranks on the other campers, and especially John, almost like Reggie Mantle from the Archie comics. Iggy is the bespectacled nerdy kid who tends to be rather uptight, nervous, and prone to getting all panicky when things go wrong. And lastly, Binky is the younger brother of Iggy, who is more rambunctious and adventurous than his older brother, though this often gets him into trouble. Of course, like a lot of other animated shows, this show is not without its main recurring villain. That would be Rex DeForest III, who is often scheming to try to get Camp Candy closed, with help from his loyal yet bumbling sidekick Chester. These two are actually the more weaker characters of the entire show, mainly because they're just the stereotypical bad guys that try to cause trouble just to try and get the camp or whatever location closed, just because they believe that the land rightfully belongs to them. I mean, that's just been done to death, even back in the 1980s. We've all seen this trope before, where a land developer tries to get a summer camp or community center shut down, only to continuously fail each time. I mean, that can work, depending on if it succinctly moves the plot along or not. But here, it's been done a lot of times that it can get very tiring after a while. But fortunately, not every episode of the series has Rex and Chester trying to get Camp Candy shut down. Other episodes focus on other situations, both camp-related and non-camp-related, without focusing on the dilemma of getting the camp shut down. For example, there was one episode where John goes on vacation to New York City, only to end up getting put through the ringer upon encountering a lot of the problems that are associated with the Big Apple itself, such as pickpockets, insufficient resources, and even having to resort to making camp in Central Park, more specifically the Central Park Zoo. They even had an episode focusing on a polka party, and one where John and the campers meet with the TV stars of a horror show. As for my thoughts on the show, I thought that it was pretty mediocre, even in spite of the fact that I do have a few memories of watching the show on Saturday mornings when I was younger. While the concept of an animated version of John Candy acting as the camp counselor of a summer camp actually does sound very interesting, the way that they utilize that idea seems rather few and far between. The reason for this is because while you can't help but laugh at John and all the antics and situations that he gets himself into, sometimes they really stretch out the jokes a bit too far. It's almost like what they did with Socrates in the third season of Adventures from the Book of Virtues, when the producers would have him get into a situation only for the joke to get stretched out too far. I mean, yeah, some of the jokes regarding what happens to John are pretty amusing, but other times they can get a little too zany and over the top, even by the show's standards. Take a look at Mr. Bogus, where the title character would often get himself into a comedic situation, but at least they don't get too carried away with what happens to him when he does end up on the receiving end of any comedic abuse that comes his way. But anyway, speaking of the third season of Adventures from the Book of Virtues, you may recall me mentioning how the voice cast for that season had voice actors from the Ocean Group in Canada, compared to how the first two seasons of that show had regular American voice actors and celebrity guest stars doing the voices. Although with Camp Candy, it's actually the inverse, with the first two seasons of the show having voice actors from the Ocean Group doing the voices, with a few American voice actors, while the third season completely switched to an all-American voice cast, save for John Candy himself, who was actually Canadian. And here's another thing to talk about here, the theme song. Oh my gosh, that is just the most catchy theme song that I have ever heard, even on par with that of the Twinkle the Dream Being theme song. That's because it was actually written by Harry Nilsson, whom a lot of you might remember for writing songs back in the 60s and the 70s, such as One, Without You, and especially for composing the score for the live-action Popeye film from 1980. Not only did Nilsson write the theme song, but he and John Candy actually sang it in a duet, which is just amazing in and of itself. But even in spite of the really amazing theme song, the show is still rather mediocre in its usage of depicting what life is like in a summer camp. So it is to this end that I will give Camp Candy 6 stars. John Candy was a pretty great actor up until he died back in 1994, which I think is a shame because he had a lot of potential to expand his acting range throughout the 90s. But unfortunately, that all ended up crashing down to the ground when he died, as well as the fact that his last two movies that he starred in, which were Wagons East and Canadian Bacon, were either really terrible or received mixed reviews from critics. Though technically, while Canadian Bacon was released a year after Wagons East was, Wagons East was actually the very last film that John starred in. Even more unfortunate that he ended up dying during production, to the point that the producers had to try and work around it, even including stunt doubles, which were very obvious. But anyway, even if John Candy has been dead for over 30 years now, the very least we could do is look back fondly on all the stuff that he's been and reminisce about his performances. And even if Camp Candy is not quite what we expected it to be, at least we can all commend John Candy for giving his A game in his first and only animated series. Well, anyway, that wraps it up for this episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. Just like before, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for even more videos from me, whether they're more episodes or something else. So until next time, later!